Okay. Hello. Thank you, everybody, for coming. What a fabulous turnout to our first in our speakers list series. This is fantastic. Thank you again for coming. The food has run out very quickly. Next time, I'll be sure to order more. It is really my pleasure for our first speaker of the seminar series this year. Excuse me, I'll put this down. I'm the acting director of the school environment, and I really appreciate following this tradition of a speaker series that was happening last year that was very successful, and I would like to keep that going and be successful this year. It's my pleasure to have our first speaker of our series who agreed to join last minute, and I'm very appreciative. Does really fantastic research, free trade, poverty issues, developing countries on coffee, and there's coffee in the back of the room now that we're talking about it. Dr. Fridell is a CRC, a Canada Research Chair here at St. Mary's, and he's also a member of the Royal Society of Canada. What is it? Emerging?
The new college.
There we go. Congratulations. That's really notable, that emerging research, those skills that are being developed, that's quite outstanding. And you have written 3 books, and I'm assuming you're working on your 4th book in progress?
One day.
Yes. Yes, looking forward to it. I will keep it very short and turn it over to our first speaker. Looking forward to your presentation.
All right, well, thanks for the opportunity to be here. I should thank the School of Environment and Dr. Linda Campbell for the invitation. I should thank Cassie. I don't think she's here, but Cassie McDonald did a lot of organizing for the event, so that's also much appreciated. I'm used to having the power of my clicker, but I don't today. Linda is my clicker, so I'm going to be doing a lot of hand motions. So this is a little bit about what my research has been on for the last, 10 or 15 years. I'm actually not working as much in fair trade these days as I once did. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about fair trade and some of the challenges that it brings, and I'm going to ask this question about whether or not fair trade does or doesn't fight poverty. So first, for those of you that don't know, or sometimes people think they know, but they don't really understand what the basics of fair trade are, I always begin with this slide right here that gives you an example of what fair trade certification is anyways. Lots of people can call lots of things fair trade. But when I talk about fair trade, I mean fair trade certification. There's the logo right there. It's an international organization, Fair Trade International, that has organizations in over about 20 countries now. So it's a network of southern producer groups and northern companies of all types. So the southern producer groups are invariably farmers' cooperatives. They can be plantations depending on the product, and those plantations will have to have a unionized workforce, or at least a worker involvement in the running of the plantation on some level, in the running of the fair trade portion of the plantation. But in the north, it can be anything from McDonald's to Walmart to Starbucks to smaller 100% fair trade certified companies like Just Us Coffee here in the Maritimes that does 100% of their beans are certified fair trade. Planet Bean in Guelph is an organization I've worked with in the past. They're pretty fantastic. So it's been around since the 1980s and 1990s. We have Fair Trade Canada as the Canadian representative of this. And it involves these sorts of principles. Democratic organization, which of course we can ask what that means, but it means a farmer cooperative or some sort of union or similar to union representation for workers. No child labor, environmental sustainability. There's a minimum guaranteed price, although I've recently discovered actually that doesn't apply to every commodity in fair trade, which is interesting for me to learn, including rice. And there's social premiums that are paid on top of the minimum price, and it goes to the cooperative or the organization of workers, and they have to decide collectively as a community how to spend that money. And it invariably gets spent on things like education, healthcare, processing facilities, roads, buses, things like that. So, that's the general snapshot. How do we assess fair trade? Does fair trade fight poverty? Well, I'd say on this one, there's a lot of literature out there nowadays, certainly far more than there was 10 years ago. I'd say it's a bit of a mixed bag. This concept with Bacon is a useful way of understanding it. You know, he says fair trade can reduce livelihood vulnerability for small farmers and rural workers. Another concept you might be familiar with is resiliency. You can make them more resilient. It provides higher prices. It can give them better access to credit and technical assistance. But all of that is actually very contingent. It's all about whether it's under the right conditions. So it's a really mixed bag. Just to give you an example of where my own past research has been on, I originally did research on coffee, on the Union of Indigenous Communities of the Isthmus region in Oaxaca, Mexico. That was a very interesting organization to study. They're still around. They're one of the most successful fair trade cooperatives in the world. They're actually a founding member of fair trade and what the fair trade idea is. They helped create the concept. They're extremely well organized, and they've had many successes over the years. They built their own school, their own hospital, small hospital. They have their own bus system because the government won't provide one in their region. They have various improvements to their home. They're very well organized politically. Now recently, there's been a big coffee leaf rust crisis in Mexico and Central America. I'm not sure if many of you know about that. But it's been absolutely devastating to this cooperative and to many farmers in Mexico. And they're still going along, but certainly a year or two ago, they were sending letters to their partners saying that we're on the verge of collapse. Then I went to the Caribbean, and I looked at fair trade bananas in the Eastern Caribbean. And that was pretty depressing. You know, I saw a lot of sort of marginal, modest, and important gains in coffee. I did not see that in the Caribbean. When I went to St. Vincent and the Grenadines and looked at fair trade bananas. In fact, a lot of the banana farmers there, I would say, would characterize it as being nothing short of a disaster for them. They had an old preferential trade agreement with Europe, which I'll try to talk about in this presentation near the end, and that gave them higher prices and better incomes. They afforded houses, they were sending their kids to university in Toronto and things like that. That agreement was deemed an affront to free trade at the World Trade Organization, and it was gradually eroded, and so then fair trade moved in to try to pick up the slack. But for them, fair trade paid them less than what they got paid before. It might have been more than what the market price is, but it was less than what they were used to getting. And it came with, of course, a ton of rules that you had to adhere to, very small farmers, small family-run banana farms, very rare actually to have banana farmers in the global economy at this small a size, surviving and thriving. So about 90% of them have left the industry. And as 90% of them went bankrupt or left the industry, fair trade was able to certify 90% of the remaining banana farmers. And in St. Vincent and Grenadines, I'm pretty certain that number declines every year. There's a lot of other things I could say about the banana experience. But I'd say the general snapshot of fair trade is that it can provide more stable and higher prices. It can provide access to infrastructure and other services. And in particular, it builds bonds of sort of solidarity. But I think it would be wrong to not say that in most cases, fair trade certified farmers remain in poverty. So there are many challenges that remain. First, almost invariably the income a fair trade farmer receives, while higher, is still a poverty income. If you take a look at, say, national poverty rates, it would still be mostly considered a poverty income. There's a lot of other challenges. Much of the additional income that fair trade farmers get, they have to spend on meeting the standards of fair trade. Meeting fair trade standards can be very difficult. You have to hire extra workers, so there is more income that way in the community. In the case of the banana farmers I mentioned, they were very frustrated that they were very, very small plots of land, but every one of them had to have a bathroom facility. It's very costly for them. There's limited markets for fair trade. Right now, only about 35% of what a fair trade farmer sells, this is in coffee. This is coffee here. About 35% of what a fair trade coffee cooperative is selling right now is on a fair trade market. The other 65% is just being sold on regular markets because there's not enough market to sell the rest. And that's a large gap. You'd have to triple fair trade sales to close that gap. There's a lot of conflict about the standards. There's a lot of often very bitterness about the fact that these standards are generally developed in Europe and North America. They're imposed on workers. One really excellent book draws a distinction between the way fair trade standards are made and the way unions develop a collective agreement. where a union, the workers themselves are involved in negotiating that agreement. The workers themselves oversee the agreement to see if it's being followed or not. With fair trade standards, someone else has already made the standards, and someone tells you what they are. And then you have to adhere to them. To give you an example of the kinds of challenges that can make, I'll give you the example of the Caribbean banana farmers again. To meet the increasing push for organic standards with fair trade, to be fair trade and organic, the banana farmers had to stop using a lot of their herbicides that they had been using. But these small farmers were using very modest amounts of herbicide. They didn't use many, but they were very accustomed to using it. So to meet fair trade standards, they had to stop using it, and because banana farming is not a very attractive livelihood anymore in terms of its income and prospects, most banana farmers are not young. So you'd have a situation where a 55-year-old banana farmer has to give up their technology, let's say, and then go into the banana fields with their machete, bending over in the hot sun, and hand weed their banana farm now to please a northern consumer. They were very bitter about the herbicide ban and working with their machetes. And one of them likened it to colonialism, saying, this is a colonial relationship, now I have to go in the hot sun with my machete. And there's new and new research coming out showing a lot of the varied labor conditions. These reports I'm citing at the bottom are particularly interesting. One of them on Ethiopia and Uganda actually found out that workers, now if you're a worker in a fair trade coffee farm, you don't really have too many standards. There's some, but not many. It's for the small farmer. So they found out that workers in Ethiopia and Uganda and fair trade farms that they looked at were being paid less and treated worse than on some of the larger plantations that were privately owned nearby. So, why are there these limitations? Well, I'm a political scientist by training, a historian as well. So I'm actually looking a lot about the politics of fair trade and other sorts of projects. I don't strictly look at the social conditions under which commodities are grown and whatnot. Well, one of the things I've looked at over the years is the consumer. And I ask in my research, is being a consumer really as powerful as we like to believe it is these days? People like to talk a lot about consumer power. In some academic terms, there's consumer sovereignty. The consumer is king. And that actually represents a general understanding of industry and consumers. Basically, industry, they respond to what consumers demand. They respond to what consumers tell them. And that has a lot of pitfalls to it. Well, one of them is that if there's a lack of social and ecologically just production and trading methods, the responsibility for that gets dumped on consumers. Well, we would do this, but consumers don't want to pay for it. This has been criticized for all kinds of levels. One of them is that, first of all, consumers don't have even adequate information on the commodities they produce, and even what fair trade gives you is almost nothing. So it's very difficult to exercise your consumer sovereignty when you walk into a grocery store and you're apparently supposed to know everything about all the commodities and how everything is produced. I mean, how much do I know about this table right now? Do I know this was ethically produced? I mean, how do I exercise my sovereignty over the talk I'm giving in this room? I don't know if this room is an ethical classroom or not. So there's a lot of sort of assumptions about consumer knowledge, what consumers are supposed to know. And of course, they do make their decisions under the barrage of corporate advertising. And by some estimates, big business alone in the US spends $1 trillion a year on advertising. Well, why would they spend $1 trillion a year on advertising? Because it works. They're not fools. They don't just like to throw $1 trillion a year down the drain. They spend a ton of money trying to engineer our demands and engineer what we want. From the day you were born in our society, you are immediately connected to advertising in this society. And people are working very hard to engineer your demands. One of the other challenges about laying so much on the shoulders of the consumer is that it takes as a given our highly unequal global economy. It's very environmentally destructive. There's gross inequalities about it. Fair trade just inserts itself into that inequality and says we need a little bit more for the farmer. But in particular in political terms, what I've really toyed with over the years is this fantasy of the market as a democracy, and the idea that a consumer is participating in something democratic when they vote with their dollars. But the reality is there's nothing particularly democratic about a market. In particular, what a market does very, very well is it shields an individual consumer from the outcome of their decisions. That's not very democratic at all. In theory, if we all belong to some sort of democratic community in this room, and we all make decisions about ourselves, we might have to pay the price if we make a decision that's wrong. That's not what the market does. When I go to the market and I'm going to buy Maxwell House today, well, that might have ramifications for a poor farming community in Guatemala, but it has absolutely no impact on my life at all. The market has entirely shielded me from being responsible for my decisions. I might feel morally or ethically responsible, but I don't actually have to pay for what those decisions are. So there's really not a sense of democracy or shared responsibility. Shared responsibility means you actually share in the outcomes of your choices. But the global market protects you from that. And the last one I throw on here is just to give you a sense here. Very often I'm asked about consumers and their selfishness. So I threw this back in on the bottom because I actually, I'm really not that critical of the consumer. I mean, I think a consumer is all of us. We're all consumers, and actually consumers are workers, and workers are consumers. And by the time you're a consumer, all you're doing is you're going into a grocery store and purchasing products that have already been produced, traded, everything, all the way along the chain. The consumption part is the very last part of that chain. Everything else has already been done. If anything, I think there's an irony with ethical trade projects that they dump a lot of responsibility on the shoulders of consumers. When consumers are just people with their kids on their shoulders in a grocery store. And they don't really wield that much power anymore. And the second sort of cynical positioning I've had on this is about transnational corporations. Well, we have to be very careful when we think about transnational corporations and partners in development. And I think we have to be careful about how readily or easily we might want to, and I would understand that desire, to buy into what corporations want you to think of them. When it comes to something like fair trade, which I've looked at historically in my work, corporations were not the original drivers of fair trade, right? It was NGOs and local coffee chains or whatever. We have to ask if a corporation, by its structure, not by the happy CEO that runs it, is designed in a way that actually can meet the values and goals of fair trade. So, here's Starbucks, where I've done a lot of research over the years. In 2014, Starbucks purchased 8.6% of their beans certified fair trade. Now, of course, Starbucks will tell you all their beans are fairly certified because they certify 80-something% of them themselves, and there's a few other projects that they're involved in. And that's not to say, by the way, that when Starbucks self-certifies, there's nothing involved in those projects. There are things, but they're weaker than fair trade certification. That is actually distinct from some of the original fair trade partners. So I mentioned earlier Just Us Coffee. I mentioned Planet Bean. Well, both of those organizations buy 100% of their beans certified fair trade because they are politically and morally engaged in the project of fair trade. Whereas a transnational corporation wants to buy as little fair trade as they can to stave off criticism. This amount of fair trade purchases, by the way, makes Starbucks the largest fair trade purchaser in North America and gives them considerable influence over the direction of fair trade. Starbucks, like all major corporations, most major corporations, is a major tax avoider. Now that's different than tax evasion. I'm sure Starbucks probably participates in that as well, but I've not read that, so this is being filmed, so I have no evidence of that. Probably never happens. But they are a tax avoider. And here's two examples that were in the news the last few years. In 2012, it was revealed that Starbucks UK, its sales were £3 billion from 1998 to 2012, but it somehow managed to pay only £8.6 million in taxes. So it paid the equivalent of around 1% of their sales, their revenue they paid in taxes. There was a huge uproar in the UK over this, by the way, when they found out. People protested, and eventually Starbucks agreed to pay more tax money than they were legally obliged to pay. This is through all kinds of creative price transferring and stuff like this. I'm sure you guys can envision what that entails, where different subsidiaries of Starbucks claim different amounts of the product, and you make sure that your taxes are paid in the countries that have the lowest tax base. And they were criticized again 2 years later for a very similar ruling from the EU that just came out. The EU ruled against the Netherlands and Starbucks, so the government of the Netherlands was involved in this, for a private tax deal that allowed Starbucks to transfer money between sister companies to avoid taxes. And the EU actually told Starbucks and the Dutch government that they had to agree for Starbucks to pay $32 million back to the government. So what does this mean politically? Well, politically, it means that corporations don't like to pay their taxes. But without taxes, where do you have money for education and healthcare and other kinds of public infrastructure? Where do you have money for development assistance and development aid if the wealthiest and most powerful players in our society don't want to pay their taxes? What corporations prefer to do is not pay their taxes, but then make discrete development projects at their own control so that they get the branded benefits from that. But they are big into saving money. And it leaves billionaires like CEO Howard Schultz in very awkward, I would say, political positions. Howard Schultz is the CEO of Starbucks. He's a very passionate critic or very passionate defender of government austerity and debt reduction. And he even had one day in Starbucks, I think a year or two ago, where he had them write something about reduce your debt on every Starbucks cup, because he's really a passionate defender in reducing government spending, because government's spending beyond its means. Of course, if all the transnational corporations in the world paid their taxes properly, then the government would not be spending beyond its means. It's also fiercely anti-union. This is not to say that Starbucks doesn't offer their workers a better package than, say, a McDonald's worker. They do. But Starbucks likes to have control over what they offer their workers and what they don't. The workers are still relatively low-paid real-estate workers. Now, there's a coffee chain in Chile that I spoke with just a while back. And this coffee chain is owned and run by Starbucks. Chile has a booming coffee market. And in fact, the South in general has a booming coffee market. Some people predict that, by 2020, 50% of the world's coffee will be sold in the South. Brazil's on par almost to reach the US as the world's largest coffee consuming country. Some think that China, which actually has a very small coffee market relative to the size of its population, still could be the world's second or third largest coffee consuming country over the next 5 years. So Chile has experienced booming sales, and they've experienced a boom in cafe culture. The coffee chain here that we're talking about has 57 stores. In 2009, workers at that store successfully unionized, which would be very rare by North American standards, by the way. There was unionizing efforts on Starbucks in BC in 2000, and about 10 stores successfully unionized, Starbucks stores, and Starbucks just refused to negotiate with them for years until the workers left and the union collapsed. The Starbucks Coffee Chile Trade Union. In Chile, they have fairly weak labor laws so that you can actually opt in or out of a union as you want. So it involves 55% of the workforce initially. The company fiercely resisted. They refused to bargain collectively. They refused to acknowledge the legal role of the union. They intimidated workers from signing on to union agreements that they could be part of the union. They retaliated against union members, changing their promotions and shifts and things like that. They advised and financed a group of workers to sabotage the union from the inside. They infiltrated the union with their spies. They closely monitored the union's statements on Facebook and Twitter. And by 2015, they had succeeded in reducing union membership to 5% from 55%. Now, just a minute here. How do I know this? Well, actually, the organizers of the union, they're amazing people. They're part of the student movement in Chile as well. They fought back. They carried out 2 legal strikes. They won 4 legal cases against the coffee chain in Chile. Another reflection of how weak labor laws are, that you can actually win a lawsuit against a transnational corporation 4 times. And I don't know how much Starbucks had to pay for it, probably $50 or something. I'm sure it was more than that. It was probably $20,000 or something. The company, in fact, was accused out of these legal suits of violating every major anti-union practice in Chilean law. Eventually, when things seemed most dire and the union was on the verge of collapse, these organizers very cleverly launched a case against Starbucks at the OECD. Chile is a fairly wealthy country these days and is a member of the OECD. And the OECD has guidelines for multinational enterprises. It's not really a court. It's sort of like you can complain to the guidelines, and they look it over and they can kind of condemn the company. So the OECD looked it over and criticized Starbucks for its failure to recognize the union. Embarrassed, very shortly after, the company backed down and agreed to collectively bargain with the union. Now, right now, that union's in court for its 5th time with Starbucks again. But perhaps the worst part of it that struck me when I spoke to Andreas Giordano Salazar was that part of their mobilizing was a hunger strike launched by 3 of the union leaders in 2011. And eventually, the union organizers, let's see, how long were they? They camped outside headquarters for 12 days. They lost an average of 26 pounds each, but the company didn't budge at all, so they called it off. And this is a quote from him. He goes, "They didn't care and maintained their refusal to negotiate until the end, and I'm sure that if we had not stopped, they would have let us die rather than doing what was right." After this strike, by the way, the company agreed to voluntarily increase the salaries of its baristas. So, what does this tell us about the direction of fair trade? Starbucks does have better jobs than, say, Tim Hortons. But even the best of these types of companies in the retail world only provides so much in terms of wages and benefits. The reality is that corporate social responsibility has grown alongside growing economic inequality in the world. And this is something that these union organizers in Chile are very aware of. The most recent Oxfam report says that 62 of the world's richest people own as much wealth as the poorest 50% of the world's population, roughly 3.5 billion. So about 62 people own as much wealth as 3.5 billion. Interestingly, in 2010, it was 388. So a few more years down the road, there'll be 8 people that own as much wealth as the world's poorest 50% of the population. In this world, retail workers are left with precarious jobs and relatively low pay. And there's certainly a lot of political questions people have been asking these days in terms of whether or not fair trade pits relatively poor retail workers against poor small farmers and rural workers. Because what happens is companies like Starbucks get the halo effect of being fair trade certified. And so does McDonald's, which sells fair trade in the US. So does Walmart now, which sells a bit of fair trade. They get this sort of halo effect. And their own retail workers are often very deeply cynical and very bitter about something like fair trade certification. There's a picture of him there. And my third pillar of sort of my analysis would say, what about the state? It's really interesting how the more we become enraptured by the idea of ethical consumption, the less people believe that the state can do anything good, the less people call on the state to do things that are good. And the state can do a lot of bad things. But the state can also do a lot of very effective things. And these are 2 that I've looked at in my own research over the years. One of them is the International Coffee Agreement. Many people do not know this, but the state, actually the major coffee producing and consuming countries in the world, actually regulated global coffee prices from 1963 to 1989. So don't ever let anybody tell you they can't do it, because they can. They regulated global coffee prices. It reached all of the world's 25 million coffee farmer families, not the 3% that fair trade reaches. And in particular, these peak years from 1976 to 1989, the regular price of coffee Arabica beans was equivalent, and in some cases higher, than what we today call a fair trade price. So during these years, the regular price of coffee bean trickled down to all of the world's coffee farmers and workers to different degrees, depending on the country you lived in. And that price for all the world's farmers was comparable to what the fair trade price is that reaches 3% of the world's farmers. And remember, only 35% of their sales actually is getting that. The other agreement I looked at is the EU Caribbean Banana Regime. It's not really its official name, and it goes by so many different names. But that was the one I've already mentioned to you from the 1950s to 2006. For decades, kind of as a compensation for colonialism, Caribbean banana farmers had preferential access through a quota system to the European market, especially the UK market. This didn't just apply to Caribbean bananas, it applied to all African, Caribbean, and Pacific group of state countries, the ACP. Under this agreement, Eastern Caribbean banana farmers did very well. We're talking about small-scale, family-run banana farms making a decent enough income to buy themselves a house and send their kids to university. But I wouldn't idealize it beyond that. They weren't like living up the dream, but it was actually a sustainable income. This was declared, as I mentioned, an affront to free trade at the World Trade Organization, the US, and a bunch of larger Latin American banana producers. The US because they grow bananas in Hawaii, so Americans are very concerned about the Hawaiian banana industry. No, the real reason is the giant American transnationals in the US that get their bananas from Central America. But they were legally allowed to participate in the case because they had bananas in Hawaii. Interestingly, the Caribbean islands were not legally allowed to participate in this case, by the way. They weren't allowed to be here at the World Trade Organization because it was a unilateral agreement of the EU's. So the whole dispute was between the US and Latin American countries and the EU, with the Caribbean on the sidelines. After several suits against them, the UK reluctantly agreed to water down the special arrangement significantly to the point that it has no effect anymore. And as I mentioned, under free trade since 1990, 90% of the Caribbean banana farmers have gone bankrupt or left the business. Not just in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, but in St. Lucia and Dominica. So this raises a lot of challenges for fair trade politically. Many fair trade proponents who said, look, fair trade is actually a stepping stone to these kinds of agreements, which I think is actually a powerful argument to make. The problem, of course, is that that's not the view of the transnational corporations that increasingly drive fair trade. For them, fair trade consumerism is an alternative to these types of things. It's instead of them. These are the worst for them, right? It's like Bill Gates says, philanthropy and capitalism is an alternative to some crazy sharing thing. For those of you that haven't heard that quote. World Bank is a big supporter of fair trade certification. They serve it in their headquarters, etc. In the end, of course, I would argue that state action is absolutely necessary to expand these kinds of benefits, and that I'm not sure that fair trade works without it. But in particular, politically, we let the state off the hook by adopting only ethical consumption and letting states do what they do, which is actually subsidize giant industry. All right, so now you're really going to have to be on the ball with me here. Oh, okay, that's okay, yeah. According to Cocoa Barometer, okay, so what I would say is that fair traders are up against powerful market forces. And this is why I have nothing but the greatest respect for fair trade organizations. What are these powerful market forces? Well, according to Cocoa Barometer in 2014, a cocoa farmer in Ghana would need their income to increase by 300% to reach the absolute poverty line. So if you're a cocoa farmer in Ghana, your income needs to increase by 300%, threefold. Imagine your income increasing by 300% to reach the absolute poverty line. That same report estimates that if those farmers managed to double their yields, they would only see an income increase of 20%. So it's impossible to conceive how fair trade price could get them to the absolute poverty line. Now, does anybody want to take a guess about how much the income needs to increase for a farmer in Côte d'Ivoire? A cocoa farmer in Côte d'Ivoire? Anyone want to take a random guess?
500%.
500%? Anybody else? I think I'm an auctioneer. Going once? Going twice? All right. Let's see it. One more. 1,000%. So if you're a cocoa farmer in Côte d'Ivoire, you're waiting for your income to increase tenfold to reach the absolute poverty line. One more. This is a report that actually just came out. The International Coffee Organization recently estimated that prices for coffee beans today, in real terms, are almost the same as they were in 2000. That was about when I started doing my work. 2000 was the era of global coffee prices for the coffee industry. So even though today's prices are a little bit higher, in real terms, it's the same as when the industry was in crisis, which means that the daily life of a coffee farmer is a life of crisis. But another rather depressing statistic is this one. Moosewood's genealogy firm, I have no idea what a genealogy firm is, by the way. I mean, they do genealogies, I guess, but I'm not sure what they were doing on this report. Moosewood's genealogy firm recently estimated that, adjusted for inflation, Americans are paying the same price for a cup of coffee today as they did in 1967. Now that is a real shocker, actually, including to me, because you got to remember that's after 50 years of promoting quality, sustainability, specialty coffee. I cannot tell you how many NGOs descend on coffee farmers to tell them that if you increase your quality, you're going to get more for your coffee beans. Well, apparently after 50 years of all this, Americans still pay the same price for a cup of coffee as they did 50 years ago. And that includes the Starbucks cups of coffee. So, boy, I don't know what time here. Let me give you this example from Mark Duffield. a really smart guy. I don't think that's his official title. That's from the UK. He has this concept in this wonderful book of his of the non-insured and the insured. And he critiques the development project. He says what the development project is a form of governance, he goes, designed to deal with the outcomes, the disorder of a liberal market economy. So, he goes, liberal market economies make some people very rich, but they also erode people's traditional rights and livelihoods. They cause unemployment, poverty, inequality, and in particular, they leave the world with a surplus population of marginalized groups that can't access the benefits of a market economy. A world divided into the insured and the non-insured. The insured are those who have access to insurance-based welfare systems, public welfare paid by taxation, some private insurance and personal savings, public infrastructure, various institutional protections. He goes, the non-insured are those living outside these insurance-based systems. He criticizes the development project for saying that most development projects think of the poor as just needing basic needs and essential public goods. He says, basically, the poor have to rely on self-reliance. The poor are the surplus population. They don't get to be insured. They just get to be given stuff that keeps them alive as the non-insured. So he said the development project is actually about protecting this relationship. Now within that understanding, because we could do a lecture on Duffield himself, I think that's where we situate fair trade. Fair trade can help the non-insured. And that's an important thing to do because the non-insured are living marginalized lives, right? And we can also do things. As consumers, for example, you can choose to support those cooperatives that are 100% committed to the fair trade project. They have strong relationships with their partners in the South. They know them personally. They visit them every year. They try to give them as much money as they can. Those are kind of being just us. There are all kinds of new and exciting directions actually within the fair trade movement these days, I think, responding to these criticisms. There's the rise of Fair Trade South. There's the emergence of all these southern fair trade labeling groups that are targeting domestic markets now. Southern groups of producers are organizing and demanding a greater say on what fair trade is. There's a new emphasis in fair trade on a living wage. That might strike you as interesting, but fair trade does not profess to achieve a living wage. But now they're beginning to ask themselves if maybe that should be their goal. So I think there's lots of powerful dynamics happening within fair trade. But ultimately, I think the goal should be to promote the insured. What does work for the insured is actually not rocket science to make people part of the insured. Public health care, education, and infrastructure. Governments have successfully regulated prices and working conditions. Even the IMF now agrees, after decades of promoting flexible labor, even the IMF now agrees that reducing unions, or unions reduce inequality and improve working conditions. So now even the International Monetary Fund is reluctantly becoming a fan of the idea of unionization. I'd also say that those numbers I showed you on cocoa, those gaps, aren't nearly as big as we might at first think. A familiar statistic I often bring to my classes is that after the Rana Plaza factory collapse in Bangladesh a few years back, I think it was 1,600 people died, but the largest, most deaths in a factory accident in recorded history in Bangladesh. After that, the first thing, of course, all the companies did is say, I know, but consumers don't want to pay more. Well, Bloomberg went and did an investigation. And they said, how much more would a consumer have to pay on a $22 pair of jeans for all the workers in the factory to have safe working conditions and better wages and better working conditions, however they calculated that. How much more does a consumer have to pay on a $22 pair of jeans? So how much do you guys think? Who wants to take a guess? $1? I'm an auctionarian. No one else wants to go?
15 cents.
15 cents, we're getting closer. 3 to 5 cents. 3 to 5 cents, yeah. Sometimes people at these talks, people say $100, $2,000. Now, 3 to 5 cents. That's all you have to, in fact, 90 cents of that $20 pair of jeans is the entire cost of the factory production. Okay? So that 3 to 5 cents, I don't think means all that much to us as consumers, to be honest with you. But it means a heck of a lot to the giant transnational company that's selling 3 million pairs of jeans. If you sell, or 30 million pairs of jeans. If you sell that many pairs of jeans, 5 cents per jean is a lot of money. So the gap's actually not as large as we think. Fine slide. At the end of the day, I support fair trade, I try to consume ethically, you know. I think though that our politics also has to go beyond what we should buy and should not buy. Can we see ourselves as being more than a consumer anymore? Can we see ourselves as a citizen? Would we know what that even means? To be a citizen and have input into how things are produced from the beginning, rather than when we buy them off the shelf. It means engaging what Alain Kapoor calls the necessarily messy terrain of politics. The point being that ethical consumption actually isn't nearly as messy as thinking politically. You go and buy a fair trade certified cup of coffee. But asking yourselves why there's so many poor coffee farmers and what can be done about it is a much messier battle and a much messier journey. But the outcomes can be greater, even if you don't fully win your victories. And I can't give you guys, I don't have time here to get into examples of what kind of stuff pops to my mind when I say that. But I did highlight here Oxfam's new campaign, which I think is really exciting. Oxfam is also a leading founding organization of fair trade, by the way. And they are increasingly less interested in that and more interested in other things. They have a new Even It Up campaign where they're calling for global action on living wages, women's economic equality, free public services, universal social protection, and a crackdown on tax evasion and avoidance. Some of you may not know, but every year more money flows out of Africa through illicit financial flows than flow into Africa through development assistance. So corporations channel more money out of Africa through various clever mechanisms than the Western world gives to Africa in development assistance. So Oxfam has really taken this on, and there's actually a lot of organizations increasingly doing this as a tax justice network out of Africa. The Jubilee 2000 movement is taking on public-private partnerships. It's very fascinating stuff nowadays. So I think that's a great place to begin. In terms of my final thought on fair trade, though, I'd say fair trade is one of the better projects out there I know that seeks to provide much needed assistance and promote the resilience of the uninsured or the non-insured. And that's, in the real world, what we need to be concerned about. But if we can't find a way to take those social justice and fair trade goals to a higher political plane, if we can't get beyond the limits of consumer politics, I don't think we'll be able to attain what should be the broader goal of development in the long term, and that should be to make all of the world's non-insured people insured. Thank you.
We have time for questions.
Lock the door.
We still have coffee. Any questions? Please feel free. We have about 15 minutes left. I'll leave that to you.
Aldona, I planted her.
Is corporate responsibility an oxymoron? Can corporations ever be reined in?
I think that, yes, they can, but not in the ways that they want to be reined in. They can be reined in with unionized workforce and workers having more say over their working conditions and their livelihoods. They can be reined in by having to pay their taxes. A lot of the tax stuff I'm talking about is tax avoidance, right? So they actually legally have to pay so much taxes, but they've found so many tricks to avoid it. So I think that they could be politically reined in, but not in the way they do it. One of the critiques of corporate social responsibility is that you'll find a company that's getting criticized for their horrible working conditions in a factory in Bangladesh. So they'll go and sell a product red flashlight and give $1 million to the Global Fund, which is great. But the Global Fund, no one accused your company of not doing enough to support AIDS research. They accused you of having workers that are terribly exploited. And so I don't think we can achieve it through what the conventional understanding is of corporate social responsibility. And by the way, the Project Red's contribution to the Global Fund is less than 1% of the total money in the Global Fund. The vast majority comes from government. So they can be reined in, but in different ways. And that's the reining in they don't want. Any other questions? Yes?
Comment on both questions you just talked about. A company can simply leave because countries are not able at this time in the world to take advantage of being together. They all want, it's like our provinces in Canada, they all want their own thing. So they'll take the company, quote, jobs, regardless of anything. So that negates what you'd like to think would be corporate responsibility, because you're not dealing with what's happening in one country, you're dealing with dominoes.
Right.
So how could we, as a society, get hold of that?
Well, I mean, first of all, I obviously agree with the central point you're making, right? But I think there's more there if we had the will, which of course, when those same companies are providing all the money to our politicians, it's hard to get the will. But, you know, Canadian mining companies, for example, they could be regulated more rigorously from Canada. There's nothing globally that prevents us from doing that. It's just the fact that the Canadian government won't do it. Global agreements, like the International Coffee Agreement, is another way to keep corporations from cheating, from hopping around. And then on the other one, I'd say too that a lot of corporations aren't as flexible as we think they are. Some are. But I mean, China knows very well that you can drive a hard bargain with a company. And you can say, you want to come, like Hajun Chang and kicking away and his book Kicking Away Ladder, he basically says, governments don't realize when a company comes in, you're giving them your workers, your infrastructure, your hydro lines, your water, you're letting them destroy your environment. Negotiate hard. And China will say, okay, we'll give you access to our market, but we want you to do the following 5 things. To give you the example of Starbucks, it's like, well, Starbucks ain't going anywhere in Canada. Unless they want to give up on all the consumers they sell their coffee to in Canada, they can't sell coffee to a Canadian consumer from Germany. So in some ways, the Canadian government does have power to regulate Starbucks if they want to, for what it's worth. Yeah. But I agree with your central point about the challenges. Are there other questions? Yes.
Well, really interesting. I like your point about the role of the state and contrasting that with the idea of consumer power, I guess. And you know, I've been really struck by that in other areas that I work in. And in particular, I remember an environmental NGO, and maybe you could talk about supply chain aspects a little bit. You know, environmental NGO that had, historically, environmentalists might have been trying to, in the fishery sector, to talk with with fishing people and to talk with consumers. And the idea, if you could talk to every fishing person and every consumer, then you sort of change the way things worked. And they realized at some point that they actually, you talked about an hourglass arrangement, that the bottleneck, not bottleneck, but the real point where they could make a difference was in the distribution level, not the production of fish, not the consumption of fish, but the in-between. And even the wholesalers, I guess I would say, even before but also the big retail companies. And so a lot of effort to support small boat fishers and sustainable fisheries had been focused more at that level. And I wonder if you could sort of comment on that. Like, you talked about the state, but can you talk about that kind of supply chain where you got the distribution and the wholesalers, and is there a lot of action that happens at that level?
There is, and I think a lot of my cynicism also comes from the particular nature of studying coffee, right? Because the International Coffee Organization I mentioned here, they used to be a powerful organization that regulated global commodity prices. Now they're this sort of weak international organization that has a meeting every year and begs the corporate sector to provide more financing for farmers, right? But there is a lot of talk about that in coffee as well, at the wholesale level, among traders and amongst the big coffee trading companies. And in fact, they're meeting over this last year, and they're talking about coming up with a global certification standard to certify 100% of the world's coffee farmers. But of course, the cynic in me says what you'll get 100% of the world's coffee farmers certified, and the majority of them living in poverty. Because the real trick becomes, when push comes to shove, how much do they really want to ante up? Or how much do they think they can ante up if they want to stay competitive with tight margins against other giant companies, right? There's a part of me that believes they would be spared these negotiations if they would just concede to allowing international agreements to regulate these things and provide. I mean, I went to a green shipping conference in the Netherlands recently, and Maersk and all these big shipping companies were there, and it's almost ridiculous to see how far they are from reducing their emissions to where they need to be, and how they just keep saying, oh, but the government is so useless, the private sector has to take the lead. And it's like, yeah, you're taking the lead and running us right off the cliff. You know what I mean? Like, corporations have been taking lead for 25 years, and climate change is not doing great. But beyond that, I mean, I get what you're saying, and I don't know if I know more about the recent trends to explore that beyond that.
I was wondering in particular whether state regulation can focus at that level.
At the level of imposing...
On wholesalers and
Oh, sure.
distributors.
I think that would be, I see what you mean now, yeah, that would be a great idea. I mean, the one thing I'll throw in too in terms of regulation is that you have these amazingly different outcomes in the coffee industry. You have the Costa Rican outcome, has challenges, but you have the Costa Rican outcome where a Costa Rican lives to be the same as an American. They have universal healthcare, universal education, a tiny country, historically very dependent on coffee and bananas, and they have these amazing social outcomes because in the 50s the government decided, politically, for all kinds of strife, to create a social welfare state. And then, so many kilometers up the way is Guatemala that has completely different social conditions. So I think government can even regulate domestically, even in the era of globalization. Leonard?
You and I discussed this before in class, but I mean, the cost to the consumer, whether it's coffee, in my case rice, I have experience with, and other products, the cost of certification is extremely high. If you're a poor producer, or even if you're a small rice mill owner, and you need to have your rice organically certified, you're talking, 30, 50, even more, $1,000 just to get the basic infrastructure in place. And most people cannot, most farmers cannot afford that. So I mean, in a sense, once you almost have to equalize that process, because if you can't equalize that process somehow, it's just not affordable.
Yes, the most successful in the coffee, the most successful cooperatives are the ones that are the relatively better off of the poor, for the very reasons you've said. Even when they don't impose direct costs on you, there's still costs. Yes, and a lot of work, and you were telling me some interesting stuff about them targeting domestic markets, which I think is probably very useful. But what's happening is that now, if you want to be a successful farmer cooperative, you feel you have to get fair trade certified. So what begins as a gift turns to a kind of imposition.
But you feel you have to be certified because Westerners are telling you to do it.
Yeah, exactly, because they won't buy it. But I have a student of mine who also anecdotally told me about a small-scale coffee roaster in the U.S. that she knows. And her story was that he went into it thinking he was going to give as much money as possible to the farmers. And then he found out, oh my God, I can barely keep my local roaster going without collapsing. Like, I'm hardly making any money. And so I think that there's these market fantasies that pervade the whole process. The think that you'll run a small coffee cooperative and just have tons of money to give to your farmers, that's not the way the global market works, right? The real money is in the biggest players who make a lot of money through tons of purchases. Right? Yes?
I was just wondering if you could speak to the small producer symbol that's rising out of Latin America, and that's becoming now, I think, a counter to certifying fair trade.
Yes.
But I don't know if you want to speak, it's coming from the indigenous movements.
Yes.
And it's actually they're setting the standards in terms of sustainability models, and it's not well known in Canada. And I know Just Us, as an example, is purchasing that way now.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Through that certification?
Certification of SPP.
Good,
But
Just
again,
Us. See, another reason why you should buy Just Us and not Starbucks.
So they're exactly.
Sure.
But they're not making the same dent. Like, they'll go through Guatemala, and for example, the only coffee buyers that have also gone to Guatemala are from Japan, who helicopter in and leave, but they never see a buyer. Like, that's actually, but whereas Just Us has been there for 20 years, Sweat Coffee, and they go annually. It's just not well known,
Yes.
this information. But I'm just wondering if you're seeing that as another model.
Yes.
Because it's, and I think in Canada as well, we could apply that model in terms of our First Nations, our farmers, our exactly.
Well, we could go on at long length for that, but just the brief part of it is that...
Sorry to interrupt. We have time for 2 more questions. I'm just going to be typing a couple of things on the screen. That doesn't mean that I'm ignoring you. Please continue your questions.
You're working on an email?
Yes, it actually is.
Well, then I will be exceptionally brief and just say you actually summarized it very well. I've only really read that book on it that Firma produced a year or 2 ago. I think it's an exciting thing, the small producer symbol. Will they find the market they need? I don't know, but I think it's a whole new way of envisioning what fair trade is. And I think it's very exciting. And of course, it's also small farmers trying to counter this trend towards big coffee farmers, right? One of the things I mentioned earlier, the influence of Starbucks, well, a few years back, Fair Trade USA agreed to start certifying giant coffee plantations. and they broke from the rest of the fair trade system out of the disputes that led to. And part of the dispute was small scale farmers in Latin America said it should be for small farmers. Now we could talk a whole seminar about that debate actually. So I think it's very exciting, and I would also say there's lots of cool stuff happening in the north for local markets. And what is that one with the tomato workers in Florida? Is it Immokalee workers? This is an amazing new model there where they basically pressured all these restaurant chains to buy tomatoes under different growing conditions where the workers have better protections, there's less sexual violence against the women workers. They go and they do survey the workers all the time to verify that they're being treated better and all. They pay a little bit of extra money. It's a very exciting project, and the only major chain that won't buy from them, by the way, is Wendy's. So my kids were very disappointed to find out that I'm never going to go to Wendy's again. Until Wendy's smartens up. Yeah. Are there any more questions? Yes.
Yes. Besides, obviously, you spoke about the state. So besides job creation, why isn't the state? This might be a naive question, but like, why else would the state not regulate corporations to abide by, you know, like fair trade, not fair trade, but policies that help farmers in like global south?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question. So, but what I would say is this: is that I actually think rationally, you could make a case that they should, and that on some level it wouldn't hurt them the way they think it would. But of course, in a real global economy, you have competing interests. So you might have one giant transnational that doesn't care what the benefits are for the global economy or the regional economy or the national economy. They care about their quarterly profits now. And so it's incredibly difficult to persuade those companies to want to allow our governments to pass that kind of legislation. And of course, our politicians constantly have to look to who's lobbying them, who's paying to fund their political campaigns. When they have to do that all the time, they're not, I mean, the Canadian mining stuff was a great example. The government came close-ish to passing some legislation that would regulate Canadian mining companies in Latin America, but they didn't have the guts for the battle. That's what I would say. I'm no Canadian.
Thank you so much for that presentation. What an amazing start to our seminar series. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your experience and your research. I'm going to be looking at coffee in very different ways. I do buy Just Us, and I have for quite some time, so I'm happy I made that decision. And I also want to say thank you. And the plan is that every 2 weeks we will have a seminar. It might be every week, depending. There are some 2 or 3 gaps still left in our schedule. So if you know of somebody or if you're willing to be a speaker, I have my information up on the screen. And I have my email and the school email. It's an interdisciplinary seminar series, so really any topic related to the environment, we're open to anything. But good speakers, please. Good presentations. And if you are unfamiliar with the School of Environment, the events that are going on, the top email goes to Cassie McDonald, our secretary. And if you email her, you can be put on the mailing list for our events and newsletters. There's a whole bunch of events that happen, and we are happy to share what's happening in your departments, your units, or what have you. We can add that into our distribution list if you'd like.
Is this available online to watch again or to share?
This PowerPoint?
This talk is recorded, so
Oh, yeah, why don't we record it? That's a good question.
Can we access it?
Yes. We do try and video all of them with permission from our presenters, and it will not happen every time, but we do try and get that approval. There will be a slight delay because captioning will be added to the videos to make them accessible, and then they will be uploaded. School of Environment has a YouTube channel, and I believe the link is on our website. I will double check that. Last year, all of our seminar series are now online for the YouTube channel. Any other questions before we wrap up? Awesome. The next time we're going to have pizza, just to let everybody know. So I'm going back for pizza and sandwiches, but there'll be more food next time for sure. Thank you so much for coming.